Ardennes Forest, December 19th, 1944. The morning air is frozen, gray, and silent. Until it isn't. A German Panther emerges from the mist, black cross painted over frost, its engine growling like a trapped animal. The gunner spots movement at 900 yards, a low, fast silhouette cutting through the snow. American tank destroyer, 3 o'clock. The Panther halts. Its massive 75mm cannon swings toward the shape. The gunner breathes steady, aiming, waiting for range data. But the shape moves again, faster this time. It's not advancing, it's circling. Through his periscope, the commander blinks. The enemy machine is impossibly quick, darting from cover to cover, throwing up white plumes of snow. The German loader shouts, "It's a light tank!" "No," the commander mutters. "It's too fast." The Panther fires, a thunderclap that shakes the forest. The shell slams into a ridge and explodes, a second too late. The American vehicle is already gone. A second later, a flash erupts from the tree line on their flank. A streak of fire cuts across the fog. The Panther's turret rings with the impact, 76mm armor piercing, punching through its thinner side plate. Inside, chaos. The driver screams. Flames blossom. The last thing the gunner sees through the smoke is a streak of motion, that same blur of green, vanishing at a speed that doesn't belong to any tank. 55 miles per hour. That was the M18 Hellcat. The Germans had a name for it after that morning. Der Blitzgeist, the lightning ghost. To them, it wasn't a vehicle. It was an insult to physics. A machine that appeared, killed, and disappeared before a crew could even reload. In most tank duels of World War II, power decided the victor. The heaviest gun, the thickest armor, the longest range. The Tiger and Panther were kings of that world, steel gods of the battlefield. But the M18 Hellcat played by different rules. It wasn't built to endure. It was built to vanish. When a German crew spotted one, they had about 3 minutes to act. 3 minutes before the Hellcat was gone, repositioned, or worse, already behind them. That was the paradox of the late war. The slow, invincible beasts of 1943 now hunted by machines that were faster, lighter, and infinitely more flexible. The M18 wasn't supposed to work. Thin armor, open turret, a lightweight engine better suited for an airplane. But on the field, its speed turned those flaws into weapons. At 55 miles per hour, it could relocate 6 times faster than a Panther could turn its turret. It could cross a kill zone before a Tiger could even reload. It was a product of American industry stripped of romance, an engineer's answer to the myth of invincibility. The Germans had built monuments. The Americans had built velocity. And when those two philosophies met in the fields of Europe, the results rewrote the math of armored warfare. In the war's final winter, the M18 Hellcat didn't win by being stronger. It won by being faster than fear. This is the story of how a cheap, open-top tank destroyer humiliated Germany's best armor, broke the myth of the Tiger, and proved that sometimes survival isn't about armor thickness. It's about how quickly you can disappear. 3 minutes. That was all a German crew had. And after that, the Hellcat was gone, already hunting someone else. In every German after-action report of 1944, one phrase repeats like an accusation. The American tank destroyers are reckless. It wasn't meant as praise. It was disbelief. To the Wehrmacht, a tank was supposed to be a fortress, a machine that carried its protection with it. The Tiger I weighed 57 tons, carried 120 millimeters of frontal armor, and looked unstoppable from every angle. Inside its steel walls, crews felt invincible. Then they met the M18 Hellcat, a 17-ton tin can with paper-thin armor that could be punctured by machine gun fire. It didn't even have a roof. Its turret was open to the sky. Its sides were barely thicker than a refrigerator door. On paper, it shouldn't have survived a single battle, but paper doesn't measure movement. To the American Army, the M18 wasn't a tank. It was a tank destroyer. And that distinction changed everything. The U.S. Tank Destroyer Command, founded in 1941, believed that mobility could replace armor. Their doctrine was clear: seek, strike, and move. They didn't want slow brawlers. They wanted hunters. The Hellcat's thin armor wasn't a flaw. It was an intentional trade-off. Every inch of steel removed from its hull meant more speed, more acceleration, more room for the only thing that mattered: a 76mm gun and a crew fast enough to use it before the enemy realized they were there. German crews called it suicidal. American crews called it calculated. Because in the Hellcat, you didn't wait for the enemy to find you. You found them first, and then you disappeared. The design logic was simple but brutal. Armor slows you down. Slower tanks die slower, though. But they still die. A fast tank that never gets hit lives forever. It was war reduced to physics. That's why Hellcat crews trained differently. They didn't learn how to trade blows. They learned how to vanish. They used map reading, radio coordination, and timing like sniper teams. They memorized distances, how long it took to crest a hill, how long to reverse, how long before a German gun could rotate. The average German Panther took nearly 19 seconds to traverse its turret 360 degrees. The Hellcat could reposition its entire vehicle 200 yards in the same time. That was the duel. 19 seconds of geometry versus 19 seconds of velocity. The Germans built tanks to dominate ground. The Americans built machines to escape it. But to the casual observer, even to some Allied officers, the Hellcat looked absurd. Open turret, lightweight armor, no stabilizer, no heavy gun shield. One well-placed artillery shell could destroy it instantly. That fragility earned it nicknames like Cardboard Killer and the Suicide Sled. Even within the U.S. Army, some called it a race car pretending to be a tank. And yet, on the battlefield, results silenced critics. In combat tests, Hellcats engaged and destroyed German armor at ranges where Shermans died. At the Battle of Aracourt, they achieved a kill ratio of 10.1 against Panthers and Panzer IVs. In one engagement, an M18 crew destroyed 4 Panthers before the Germans even located them. The key wasn't firepower, it was tempo. German doctrine depended on predictable opponents, tanks that advanced, stopped, and fired. The Hellcat refused to play that game. It moved like cavalry, not armor. One after-action report from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion described the tactic perfectly. When the enemy turned their turrets, we were already gone. When they turned again, we were shooting. Speed didn't just protect the crew, it confused the enemy. German gunners trained to fire on stationary silhouettes. But the Hellcat never stayed still. At 55 miles per hour, it blurred the lines between reconnaissance and assault. Crews even joked that if they got hit, it was their own fault for stopping. But beneath the humor was real danger. The open turret left crews vulnerable to snipers, grenades, even shrapnel. Rain soaked their radios, snow froze their ammunition. And yet, they preferred that to the alternative, being trapped in a slow-moving coffin. The M18's design told a different kind of story, one about a war that was shifting away from armor thickness toward information and mobility. Every Hellcat carried 2 radios, one for battalion command, one for artillery coordination. That meant every crew could act like its own strike team, calling fire or coordinating flanking maneuvers in seconds. German Panzers had no such network. Their crews were powerful, but deaf. Their radios often jammed, their coordination fractured. The Hellcat wasn't a better tank, it was a better system. To the Germans, that was infuriating. They had spent years perfecting the art of armored warfare, the myth of blitzkrieg, the ideal of decisive power. And now, in the war's final year, they were being outmaneuvered by machines that looked like toys. But war had changed. The industrial battlefield rewarded speed, not spectacle. The M18 Hellcat wasn't there to duel the Tiger. It was there to end the duel entirely. Because if you could move faster than fear, you didn't need armor. You only needed timing, and the nerve to drive straight at the myth and make it miss. The Hellcat was not born in a design lab. It was born out of panic. In 1942, the U.S. Army faced a terrifying truth. Its Sherman tanks were already obsolete. Reports from North Africa were brutal. German Panzer IVs and newly arrived Tigers were ripping through Allied formations at long range, their high-velocity guns turning American armor into scrapyard fireballs. The Army needed something fast, something that could kill tanks without becoming one. And so, in early 1943, the Tank Destroyer Command gave a desperate order to the Buick Motor Division of General Motors. Build a vehicle faster than anything on the battlefield. Arm it with a 76mm gun. Make it ready in 18 months. Buick's engineers stared at that order like it was a joke. But the Army wasn't joking. The challenge was simple on paper, impossible in reality. How do you make a 76mm gun platform that weighs less than half of a Sherman and still moves like a sports car? The answer lay not in armor, but in automobile thinking. Buick engineer Harley Earl, best known for sleek pre-war car designs, brought in concepts straight from Detroit: torsion bar suspension, lightweight cast hull sections, and even aircraft-inspired construction techniques. The team treated the Hellcat not like a tank, but like a hot rod with a cannon. They stripped weight everywhere. Steel armor went from 50mm to 25mm. The hull was welded instead of riveted. The turret was open-topped to save hundreds of pounds. The result was a combat vehicle that weighed just 17.7 tons, light enough to be airlifted by cargo plane, and fast enough to break every assumption the Army had about armor. At the heart of the Hellcat was a Continental R975 C4 radial engine, the same power plant used in aircraft like the T-6 Texan trainer. It produced 400 horsepower, giving the Hellcat an astounding 22.6 horsepower per ton, nearly double that of the Sherman and almost twice that of the German Tiger Scheiß. With that power-to-weight ratio, the M18 could hit 55-mile-per-hour on roads and maintain 25-30-mile-per-hour cross-country. For comparison, the Tiger, the pride of Germany's Panzer Corps, barely reached 24 mph at full throttle. The Hellcat was not built to absorb punishment. It was built to outrun it. Inside the vehicle, the design screamed minimalism. The driver sat low, peering through a narrow slit protected only by bulletproof glass. The gunner and commander operated in an open turret with no roof, surrounded by exposed ammunition. The armor around them ranged from 12mm on the sides to 25mm on the front. A German machine gun could punch through it at 300 yards. And yet, crews didn't complain. They knew what they were driving. Not a tank, but a predator. The M18 wasn't supposed to stand and fight. Its entire doctrine revolved around motion. The U.S. the tank destroyer school at Camp Hood drilled crews on what they called shoot and scoot doctrine. Engage the enemy from ambush. Fire, relocate, fire again. Never stay longer than 90 seconds in one position. That 90-second rule wasn't just tactical, well, it was mathematical. German artillery response time was roughly 3 minutes. If a Hellcat moved every 90 seconds, it could never be bracketed by return fire. In essence, the M18 turned survival into a stopwatch game. German crews didn't understand this at first. They assumed the light American destroyers would stand and trade shots. But when the first Panthers faced the Hellcat in France, they realized the truth. The enemy was faster than their own targeting system. The M18's hydraulic turret traverse, at 24 degrees per second, was faster than any German tank of the war. The Tiger's traverse rate? Barely 6 degrees per second. That meant in a close-range fight, the Hellcat could literally circle its opponent faster than the enemy could turn its gun. One German after-action report called it eine Katze ohne Panzerung, aber mit Zähnen, a cat without armor, but with fangs. The Hellcat's 76mm M18 gun wasn't the most powerful weapon of the war. It couldn't penetrate a Tiger's front at 1,000 meters. But it could kill Panzer IVs and Panthers from the side. And more importantly, it could choose when to fire. Speed gave the crew control of the engagement, and control in 1944 meant survival. When the first M18s rolled off the assembly line, even General Eisenhower doubted their usefulness. He preferred heavier armor, thicker plates, real tanks. But by the time they reached the front lines in France, the doctrine had evolved. Tank destroyer battalions worked with reconnaissance units, artillery spotters, and infantry scouts. They used radio intelligence to intercept German armor movements and pre-position Hellcats on flanks, a kind of armored guerrilla warfare that the slow, methodical Wehrmacht couldn't adapt to. By the summer of 1944, the M18 had become the fastest production armored vehicle in the world. It could hit 50 mph on European roads that stopped Tigers cold. When German soldiers first saw one, they didn't laugh. They stared. It didn't look like a tank. It looked like something from another war. One Wehrmacht officer later wrote in his diary, "They have a machine that moves faster than fear." That was the secret. The Hellcat wasn't an American answer to German armor. It was an American philosophy of war. Decentralized, mobile, industrial, efficient. Germany had built symbols. America built systems. The Hellcat was the system's cutting edge, a machine that didn't need to survive hits because it refused to stay still long enough to take one. It was the embodiment of a new logic of war, that in the age of engines, motion itself was the strongest armor of all. War isn't about who shoots first, it's about who calculates faster. And by 1944, the math of tank warfare had changed. Let's break it down. The German Tiger was 57 tons, 100 mm 20 meters of armor, an 88mm KWK-36 cannon, top speed 24 mph. The Panther, 45 tons, 80mm frontal armor, 75mm high-velocity gun, top speed 29 mph. The M18 Hellcat, 17.7 tons, 25mm armor, 76mm M1A2 gun, top speed 55 mph. At first glance, it's absurd. The Tiger outweighed the Hellcat by 40 tons, literally 3 times its mass. It could absorb punishment that would vaporize lighter vehicles. The German guns outranged and outpenetrated almost everything the Allies had. But paper armor didn't tell the whole story. The mathematics of destruction, weight, speed, traverse, communication, decided who lived long enough to shoot again. So the U.S. Army tested the numbers. A Tiger took 19 seconds to rotate its turret 360 degrees. A Panther, 15 seconds. The Hellcat's hydraulic traverse, 6 seconds. In a duel, that meant the Hellcat could circle an opponent 3 times before the German gun could catch up. Then came acceleration. The Tiger needed 25 seconds to hit 20 mph. The Hellcat did it in 6. That meant a Hellcat could appear, fire, and vanish before a German crew had even finished calling out a firing solution. Field telemetry recorded Hellcats averaging 28 mph across country compared to the Tiger's 12. The Panther could pivot faster, but its weight meant it tore up soft ground, often bogging down in mud or snow. Speed wasn't glamour. It was survival math. Because every second spent stationary increased the probability of death. In 1944, the average German tank kill on the Western Front took 3 minutes and 18 seconds from target detection to firing impact. That included turret traverse, range finding, and elevation adjustment. The M18 needed less than 45 seconds to find a target, fire, and move to a new position. That's why German commanders called it unfair. They weren't fighting tanks, they were fighting time. Let's look at energy. The kinetic energy of an 88mm shell from a Tiger at 1,000 meters was about 2.9 megajoules. A devastating punch. The 76mm round from a Hellcat carried only 1.8 megajoules. On paper, that's a losing exchange. But when you factor position and frequency of fire, the balance tilts. A Tiger averaged 6 to 8 aimed rounds per minute in combat conditions. The Hellcat? Up to 12. Over a 3-minute engagement, a Tiger might fire 20 shells. A Hellcat? 36. More importantly, the Hellcat was already moving after each burst. If the Tiger missed the first shot, odds were it would never get a second. Even more brutal was the power-to-weight ratio. Tiger White's 12 HP ton. Panther, 15 HP ton. M18 Hellcat, 22.6 HP ton. It wasn't just faster. It was alive in motion. Crews described it as riding a thunderclap. One driver said, "If you sneezed on the throttle, she'd jump 20 yards." That mobility gave Hellcats a new kind of immunity. Statistical invisibility. U.S. after-action analysis showed that in engagements where Hellcats maintained movement above 20 mph, hit probability by German guns dropped below 8%. For stationary tanks, it was 63%. That's not luck, that's physics. But speed had another effect. Communication. Tank destroyer battalions were wired for coordination. Each M18 carried 2 radios, one short-range intercom, one long-range SCR 508. Crews could coordinate flanking maneuvers in real time. German tanks couldn't. The Wehrmacht's command net was centralized, powerful but slow. Radio silence orders, encryption delays, and rigid hierarchy turned every battle into a bureaucracy. When a Panther spotted a Hellcat, it often had to report up the chain before acting. By the time permission came, the Hellcat was gone. Numbers and illusions. The Tiger's armor could stop shells, but it couldn't stop time. The Panther's optics could identify targets, but not react fast enough to changing ones. Meanwhile, American units learned to fight like a swarm. A single Hellcat might seem weak, but 3 working together could encircle an enemy, striking from multiple angles faster than German gunners could adjust. The result? The Hellcat's kill-to-loss ratio averaged 2.4 to 1 in 1944-45, the highest of any U.S. tank destroyer. It was a machine optimized not for domination, but for decision speed. In the physics of war, that was a revolution. Because armor is finite, speed is not. Every pound of steel Germany poured into its tanks slowed them down. Every ounce America stripped away made the Hellcat deadlier. The Germans built monuments to power. The Americans built a stopwatch. And on the battlefields of France and Belgium, that stopwatch ran out for the Panthers first. In the war's math, protection wasn't the key to survival. Time was. And the Hellcat, the so-called tin can, was time made of steel. September 19th, 1944. Lorraine, France. The fields around the small town of Aricourt were soaked with fog, dew, and gasoline. On paper, this battlefield should have been the graveyard of American armor. In reality, it became the M18 Hellcat's masterpiece. The U.S. 4th Armored Division had stretched its lines thin, too thin, when the German 5th Panzer Army launched a counterattack. More than 260 Panthers and Panzer IVs advanced under cover of mist, supported by artillery and Luftwaffe reconnaissance. Facing them were Sherman tanks, a handful of infantry, and a small detachment of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcats. No air support, no artillery advantage, just fast machines and nervous men. At 0700, the German armor appeared out of the fog, black silhouettes moving like giants through the fields. The Americans could hear their engines long before they saw them. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, commanding one of the 704th's Hellcats, recalled it years later. "We could feel the earth vibrate. You don't fight that kind of power head-on. You make it chase you." His crews positioned along a ridge near Lezy, hiding behind haystacks and farm walls. The visibility was under 100 yards, perfect for ambush. When the first Panther emerged, its crew didn't even realize they were being hunted. Leiper's gunner waited until the muzzle brake of the Panther's 75mm gun cleared the mist, then fired. The 76mm shell slammed into the Panther's side plate. The German tank shuddered, caught fire, and stopped. "Hit confirmed," the loader yelled. "Move!" The Hellcat reversed down the slope at full throttle, relocating before the next Panther could respond. In less than 20 seconds, it was gone. That pattern repeated across the front. Every time the Germans engaged one position, the Hellcats were already somewhere else, firing from a new angle. The fog became their camouflage. Over the course of that morning, Hellcats from the 704th and 603rd Battalions destroyed 28 German tanks for the loss of just 4 of their own. The Panthers never adapted. Their optics were superb at long range, but useless in fog. Their turret traverse was too slow for sudden flank attacks. And their commanders, bound by radio procedure, couldn't respond to a threat that moved faster than their communication network. By midday, the fog lifted. The battlefield was a graveyard. German armor burning in the fields, their commanders shouting in disbelief. The Americans advanced cautiously, Hellcats leading, engines humming at low idle. Their gunners moved like clockwork. Range, aim, fire, move. No one stayed still. By September 20th, the Germans had lost 86 tanks and assault guns in the Aracourt sector. The Americans lost 9. The ratio defied logic. But the math didn't lie. Each M18 averaged 6 kill engagements during the battle, all based on movement and coordination. They weren't dueling. They were managing time. Every 704th Hellcat operated in pairs or trios. One drew fire. The others flanked. They used roads, hedgerows, and even ditches as launch paths. The radio chatter from that battle survives in fragments. You can hear the rhythm of the doctrine. 2-4, fire and scoot. 3-1, reposition west. Don't stop, they're turning. To an outsider, it sounded chaotic. To those men, it was a symphony of survival. German reports after Aracourt read like confessions. The enemy armored vehicles moved too quickly to engage. Their tactics resembled cavalry. Cavalry. That's exactly what the Hellcat was. Not a tank destroyer, not a tank. A modern descendant of the 19th century charge, but mechanized, electrified, and weaponized with radio coordination. In the words of Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding the 4th Armored Division, the M18 didn't win because it was tougher. It won because it was faster. The Hellcat was war on a stopwatch. One German officer who survived the battle was captured the next day. When interrogated, he said, "We thought they were Shermans at first, but they vanished too quickly. We never saw them twice in the same place." That statement became unofficial proof of doctrine's success. Aracourt wasn't just a battle, it was a laboratory. The U.S. Army had just proven that a lighter, cheaper, faster vehicle could dismantle elite German armor through coordination alone. The statistics stunned even the Pentagon. The Hellcat had achieved the highest kill ratio of any armored vehicle in the European theater. After the battle, General Patton, never one to praise lightly, visited the 704th. He looked at the small, battered M18s parked in the mud and said simply, "Gentlemen, you've made me believe in speed." That was the moment the Hellcat transcended its nickname. No longer a tin can, it became the formula. The doctrine of mobility over mass had been proven in blood and fog. Aracourt taught the world a new rule. In modern war, the faster thinker wins, and sometimes the thinker drives 55 miles an hour. By late 1944, the German High Command was staring at numbers that didn't make sense. Their tanks were technically superior, better guns, better optics, thicker armor, yet their losses were accelerating. Aracourt wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom. The Wehrmacht's logistics reports from September through December 1944 showed something terrifying. Over 40% of all tank losses on the Western Front occurred without confirmed hits in return. In plain terms, they were being ambushed, flanked, and outmaneuvered before they could fire. The Tiger and Panther were designed to dominate at range. Their 75mm and 88mm cannons could destroy anything within 2 kilometers. But that range meant nothing when your enemy never stayed still long enough to aim at. German doctrine was built on control through power. American doctrine had evolved into control through speed. That shift broke the German model from the inside out. Here's how the math fell apart. A typical German tank crew, 4 men, needed 90 seconds to identify, range, and aim at a moving target. In that same 90 seconds, an M18 Hellcat could cover 1.4 miles. That meant a Hellcat could change position twice before the German crew finished aiming at where it used to be. Every delay compounded. Each misfire cost 15 to 20 seconds. Every turn of the turret drained fuel and time. Every hesitation meant another tank dying somewhere else. When the Wehrmacht's after-action analysts plotted this data, the curve was unmistakable. Mobility trumped armor at a ratio of 3:1, once battlefield communication and fog were factored in. The Germans didn't lose the armor war because their tanks were bad. They lost because their doctrine couldn't process the speed of engagement. Their command structure, top-down, slow, linear, was incompatible with an enemy that fought like a swarm. The U.S. tank destroyer units were semi-autonomous. Platoon leaders didn't wait for divisional orders. They reacted in seconds, coordinating over radio. A German battalion might take 10 minutes to redeploy. A Hellcat company could relocate and re-engage in 3. That gap was fatal. One German officer from the 113th Panzer Brigade described it bitterly in his debrief. They fight like ghosts. You see one, fire, and suddenly it's gone. Then your comrade explodes from behind you. That sense of disorientation spread through the ranks. Even elite German crews began hesitating, not out of fear, but confusion. In warfare, hesitation is death. The numbers don't lie. Between September and December 1944, U.S. tank destroyer battalions reported an average kill-to-loss ratio of 2.41. German panzer units on the Western Front dropped below parity for the first time in the war. Hellcat battalions averaged 8 minutes per engagement, compared to 19 for German armor. Speed wasn't just protecting the Hellcat. It was breaking the enemy's decision cycle. The German OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, had been shattered. The Hellcat moved too fast for the orient stage. The enemy was always reacting to a situation that no longer existed. This wasn't just new warfare. It was industrial warfare accelerated. Each M18 was a node in a moving network. Each German tank was an isolated fortress. And fortresses, no matter how thick their walls, eventually fall to something faster and more flexible. The collapse wasn't just tactical. It was economic. Germany could barely produce 20 Tigers a month by late 1944. The U.S. could build 500 Hellcats in the same time. Every loss for Germany was irreplaceable. Every loss for America was an equation already solved. Build another, train another, deploy another. The numbers widened the gap. By the winter of 1944 to 45, German armor readiness fell to 43%. Allied armor readiness remained above 82%. U.S. tank destroyer battalions were operating at full strength, rotating crews faster than the Germans could rotate divisions. Even when the Hellcat wasn't killing tanks, it was killing momentum. German commanders had to slow their advances, fearing flanking fire. Panther crews spent more time scanning their sides than aiming forward. And once that paranoia set in, speed became fear. That's the math of collapse. Not a single explosion, but thousands of seconds lost in reaction time. The Wehrmacht's mythology, the unstoppable panzers, the perfect blitzkrieg, was being undone by arithmetic. The Allies didn't outgun them. They out-timed them. Every German tank destroyed at Aricourt, Bastogne, or the Saar wasn't just a loss of steel. It was a loss of seconds. Seconds that Germany could never get back. By early 1945, the Tiger and Panther were engineering marvels trapped in a strategic museum. Their armor was irrelevant, their guns overkill, their engines fragile. The war had become a contest not of strength, but response speed. And in that race, the Hellcat had no equal. Its crews didn't think in kilometers, they thought in minutes. 3 minutes to strike, 90 seconds to move, 55 miles an hour to live. The M18 wasn't an armored vehicle. It was a metronome of modern war. And when the final reports came in, they told the same story. Germany's best tanks had been defeated not by heavier guns, but by faster math. December 20th, 1944. The Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. The forest is white, frozen, and silent. The kind of silence that comes before violence. German armor columns move west through the fog. Panzers advancing in a long black line. The Wehrmacht believes the Americans are broken, retreating. They are wrong. Near Bastogne, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion is moving in reverse, not retreating but resetting the trap. They have Hellcats, and Hellcats don't retreat. They reposition. At dawn, the temperature is 15 degrees below freezing. Visibility, 50 yards. Perfect. Captain Robert M. Evans leads his platoon through a forest track, engines throttled down to avoid giving away their position. He stops his M18 just short of a clearing, pulls his goggles up, and studies the terrain. A narrow road cuts across a valley below, the only route for German tanks heading toward Bastogne. Evans radios back. "This is Fox 3. Visual contact in 1 minute. Set up crossfire." The other crews acknowledge. They're spread out in a triangle 300 yards apart, camouflaged under frost and pine boughs. Then the sound, diesel and steel. A column of Panthers and Panzer IVs crawls into view, snow caking their tracks. At the head, a Tiger II, the King Tiger, its 88mm gun cutting through the mist like a spear. The Germans have no idea they're walking into an ambush. Evans watches through his scope. The lead tank is 600 yards away, broadside exposed. He whispers to his gunner, "Wait, wait, fire." The 76mm shell streaks across the valley and punches straight into the Tiger's side armor. The explosion echoes off the trees. The King Tiger jerks to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine deck. The German column freezes. Before they can react, 2 more Hellcats open fire from the flank. Panthers catch fire one after another, shells slamming into their sides like hammer blows. Within 30 seconds, the Germans are blind. Their formation collapses in confusion. Evans yells, "Reload! Move!" His driver slams the gear forward, the M18 sliding downhill through the snow at 40 mph. The Germans return fire. Too late. Shells tear through the forest, hitting nothing. By the time they adjust, the Hellcats are already behind them. Evans' platoon emerges from another tree line 800 yards away, firing again. The Tiger's turret tries to rotate, too slow. Another shell slams home. The beast stops moving. In less than 2 minutes, 3 German tanks are burning. Radio chatter explodes. "Fox 1 to Fox 3, reposition south, Panthers breaking off." "Copy that. Stay mobile." To the German crews, it feels like fighting ghosts. They can hear engines, see muzzle flashes, but nothing stays in one place long enough to target. For the next 4 hours, the Hellcats play the battlefield like a chessboard, firing, moving, flanking, vanishing. When the snow clears by noon, the valley below is littered with blackened wrecks. 13 German tanks lie destroyed or abandoned. The Americans have lost 1 Hellcat, hit by artillery while reversing. One crewman writes in his journal that night, "The Panzers came like giants. We made them dance like clowns." That was not arrogance. It was astonishment. The Hellcats' tactics had turned one of the worst defensive positions in Europe into an asymmetric nightmare for the enemy. German radio intercepts captured later described the engagement as infuriating, unnatural, and disorienting. One officer wrote, "They are everywhere and nowhere. We cannot hit them. They are devils on engines." By the second week of the Ardennes offensive, the 705th had destroyed 24 tanks for only 5 losses. The key wasn't bravery, it was geometry. The M18's combination of speed and communication allowed platoons to control the rhythm of battle. They fought in loops, shoot, move, reappear, repeat. The enemy's power meant nothing if it couldn't anchor the fight. Even the terrain couldn't slow them. In deep snow, the Hellcats' wide tracks distributed weight evenly. It skimmed over surfaces where Tigers sank. German tanks bogged down and became stationary targets. And the irony? The Hellcat's open turret, considered a death trap, became an advantage. Crews had full visibility in low-visibility weather. They could spot muzzle flashes through snow glare before the Germans even saw movement. Speed, vision, and coordination. That trinity turned the Ardennes into a proving ground for a new kind of warfare. The U.S. tank destroyer doctrine, mocked in 1943, was now winning battles through physics and discipline. When the fog finally cleared, German prisoners were asked what they thought they'd faced. One replied, "Small tanks that run like cars, faster than bullets." The Americans just called them Hellcats. And for the rest of the war, that name would echo through German radio traffic like a curse. Because if you saw one, and it disappeared, you knew it was already moving to your flank. And by the time you turned your gun, you were already dead. Spring 1945, northern Italy. The war in Europe is nearing its end, but no one told the men of the 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion. They're pushing through the Apennines, climbing steep, twisting roads the German tanks considered impassable. But the Hellcat doesn't care about rules. It was built to move, even where tanks shouldn't. The campaign in Italy was supposed to be slow, cautious, infantry first. But the M18's of the 805th changed that. They moved like predators in the fog, light, agile, loud enough to scare but fast enough to survive. Their job? Intercept German armor retreating toward the Po Valley. The terrain was a nightmare. Switchbacks, crumbling cliffs, and narrow passes barely wide enough for a jeep. A Panther couldn't turn here without scraping rock. But a Hellcat could glide through like a sports car. Captain Charles B. Chuck Hall led his platoon that day. His orders were simple: cut off a German armored column near Bologna. By dawn, Hall's 4 Hellcats were crawling up a goat path that wasn't even on the map. The engines whined, treads scraping stone. The crews joked that they weren't tank destroyers anymore. They were mountain goats with cannons. Halfway up the ridge, the radio crackled. Recon reports 4 German tanks heading north. 2 Mark IVs, 1 Panther, 1 half-track escort. Hall's driver grinned. Perfect. We'll meet them coming down. At 9:30 a.m., the Americans reached a high pass overlooking a narrow valley. Below, the German column wound its way uphill, unaware they were being watched. Hall signaled his crews to hold fire until the Panther came into the open. The enemy tanks were boxed in. Sheer cliffs on both sides, no room to maneuver. The Panther appeared. Its turret turned slightly, scanning the ridge. Hall's gunner whispered, "Range 800. Fire." The first shot hit dead center on the side plate. The Panther's engine compartment erupted in flame. The German column panicked. The half-track veered into the rocks. 1 Panzer IV tried to reverse. Too slow. A second Hellcat fired, hitting it squarely. 2 minutes later, the valley was chaos. Smoke, shrapnel, echoes bouncing off the stone walls. Hall ordered his men to move. "Reposition uphill to keep them guessing." The Hellcats reversed out of sight, engines roaring, then reappeared 400 yards higher. When the surviving German tank fired back, it hit nothing but stone. Within 5 minutes, the 805th had destroyed 3 enemy vehicles and vanished into the mountain mist. It wasn't a duel. It was an execution carried out by speed and mathematics. Afterward, local Italian partisans emerged from the woods cheering. They'd never seen tanks move like that, weaving through switchbacks, firing on the run, disappearing behind ridgelines. One of them shouted, "Americani di vento," the Americans of the wind. That phrase stuck. The Hellcat crews wrote it on their turrets in chalk, "of the wind." In the following week, the 805th repeated the trick across the Po Valley. They struck German supply convoys, gun emplacements, even retreating flak wagons, then sped away before counterfire could land. Their average engagement lasted under 3 minutes. Their kill-to-loss ratio, 6 to 1. But the real miracle wasn't the kills. It was where they did it. No tank destroyer in history had operated so effectively in mountain terrain. The M18's torsion bar suspension, wide tracks, and power-to-weight ratio made it the only tracked vehicle capable of fighting uphill at full speed. A Tiger II couldn't even reach those roads. The Panthers that tried often threw their treads on tight curves. The German engineers simply hadn't designed for this kind of mobility. The war in Italy ended not in a dramatic tank duel, but in a race. The Germans couldn't retreat fast enough, and the Hellcats were faster than every enemy vehicle in Europe. By April 1945, the 805th had cut off multiple escape routes across the Po River. Their M18s, often operating with infantry mounted on the back decks, became mobile assault guns, blasting roadblocks and strong points with pinpoint fire. One final engagement near Verona summed it up. A Panther tried to cross a bridge under fog cover. A Hellcat platoon caught it halfway. The lead M18 fired once, hit the bridge railing, and sent the 45-ton Panther plunging into the river below. The crew of that Hellcat painted a name on their barrel that day: Panther Dropper. They didn't need heavy armor. They had something far more lethal: momentum. When the campaign ended, General Truscott inspected their vehicles. Most were battered, dented, and riddled with shrapnel. Not one had been knocked out by a tank shell. Asked how they survived, Captain Hall said, "Sir, they couldn't hit what they couldn't catch." That one sentence summed up the entire M18 philosophy, and the shift in modern warfare that Germany never understood. The Hellcat had proven that speed could conquer even terrain, that lightness, when disciplined, was deadlier than thickness, and that the American way of war, decentralized, mobile, improvised, had finally surpassed the old European ideal of armored perfection. When the 805th rolled into Milan that May, their Hellcats were decorated with flowers by civilians. Kids ran beside them, laughing, shouting, "Macchine veloci, macchine di libertà," fast machines, machines of freedom. To the men who'd driven them, that sounded about right. Because in the last months of World War II, freedom really did move at 55 miles an hour. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Tiger, the Panther, and the mythology of invincible armor were all lying in the mud. What replaced them wasn't just a faster tank. It was a faster idea. The M18 Hellcat proved that in modern war, time is deadlier than tonnage. The numbers said it all. Over the course of the European campaign, M18 units destroyed more than 526 German tanks and armored vehicles while losing fewer than 250 of their own. That's a kill ratio of over 2.1, achieved by a vehicle that by every conventional measure shouldn't have survived. It was a triumph not of strength, but of systems thinking. Where Germany built machines of obsession, single masterpieces of steel, the U.S. built networks of motion: radios, fuel convoys, logistics lines, training schools, tactics that made every Hellcat a mobile node in an industrial swarm. The difference wasn't technology, it was tempo. The Tiger's engineers worshipped perfection. The Hellcat's designers worshipped efficiency. The Tiger was handmade, 300,000 man-hours per vehicle. The Hellcat, 10,000. Germany built 1,350 Tigers. America built 2,507 Hellcats in half the time. That wasn't coincidence. That was doctrine. In German factories, craftsmanship was a matter of pride. In American factories, speed was a matter of survival. The Hellcat was the physical manifestation of that belief. That a good enough machine in time is better than a perfect one too late. It was fast, yes, but it was also reliable. Its Continental radial engine could run 500 miles without overhaul. Crews could replace a transmission in under an hour. Tigers, by contrast, required 3 days of maintenance for every week in combat. That's why the Tiger became a legend, and the Hellcat became a war winner. The Tiger's power lived in fear. The Hellcat's power lived in motion, and motion always wins. The lesson was brutal, mathematical, and permanent. In a world where speed doubles and range triples, armor thickness becomes an illusion. Every second that a tank spends still is another second closer to its death. That's why German crews learned to dread the fog. Not because of ambush, but because of what followed it. Silence, a flash, and a streak vanishing at impossible speed. The Tiger represented control. The Hellcat represented chaos. And chaos, when measured and mastered, always devours control. Even German officers admitted it. After the war, Colonel Hans von Luck wrote in his memoir, "We no longer faced tanks, we faced movement itself." That was the moment armor died as an idea. After 1945, no military built heavy tanks in the old sense. The future belonged to medium and main battle tanks, mobile, multi-role, fast. The DNA of the Hellcat lived on in the M26 Pershing, the M46 Patton, and eventually the M60, all faster, all more adaptable, all designed to move rather than endure. Even the Soviet T-54 and later T-72 were products of the same realization. The age of stationary armor was over, because the M18 had rewritten the math. Speed wasn't the absence of defense. It was defense. It was the armor of time. The Hellcat didn't need to survive every battle. It just needed to stay ahead of one shot. And in doing so, it taught the modern world the most important law of mechanized war. That momentum is invincibility multiplied by intent. Crews who drove it never forgot. One gunner from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion said decades later, "We were scared all the time, but fear was fuel. You don't think that you move. If you stopped, you died. So you learned not to stop." He paused, then added, "That little machine taught us how to think faster than death." That's the essence of the Hellcat story. Not glory, not victory, but velocity as survival. Germany built the most feared tanks in history. The US built the one that history feared to underestimate. And when the smoke cleared over Europe, the Tiger's roar was gone. What remained was the echo of engines receding at 55 miles an hour. Proof that speed kills, even without armor. By the time the last M18 Hellcats rolled back into depots in 1945, the age of armored warfare had already shifted. The war had proven what the factories already knew. Speed, communication, and adaptability now outweighed brute strength. The world's future belonged to whatever could move faster, react quicker, and strike first. In the mud of France, in the snow of the Ardennes, and in the mountains of Italy, the Hellcat had done something extraordinary. It turned fear, that primal tanker's instinct to hide behind steel, into motion. It replaced armor with nerve. It showed that victory in modern war wasn't about standing your ground, but about owning the tempo. The M18 was never glamorous. It had no mythic silhouette, no tiger roar, no heavy tracks shaking the ground. But it didn't need them. Its victories were measured not in monuments, but in minutes, the seconds it saved, the time it stole from the enemy, the margin between life and death. When the war ended, those lessons didn't stay in Europe. They crossed oceans. They shaped doctrine, design, and destiny. By the 1950s, the U.S. Army's new tanks, the M26 Pershing, the M46, the M47, and later the M60, all shared the Hellcat's soul. Better engines, faster response, lighter armor. Even air power followed the same law. The P-80 Shooting Star, the F-86 Sabre. Faster, lighter, deadlier through velocity. The Hellcat was more than a machine. It was the moment the Allies learned that technology alone doesn't win wars. Systems do. It proved that the future of battle would not belong to those who could take the most hits, but to those who could move faster than history itself. The Tigers, the Panthers, the King Tigers all became museum pieces of perfection. The Hellcat became a blueprint. Every modern fighting vehicle, from Abrams tanks to drone swarms, still carries its logic. Don't wait. Don't trade blows. Move, strike, vanish, repeat. That was the Hellcat's gospel. Speed as armor, coordination as power. It wasn't the prettiest machine of the war, but it might have been the smartest. Because while the German tankers built fortresses, the Americans built time machines. And time, not armor, was the real weapon that ended the Panzer Age. April 13th, 1946. Langley Field, Virginia. The world is still shaking off the dust of World War II. Airfields once filled with bombers now hum with experiments. New fuels, new wings, new ideas. But on this morning, the horizon itself looks dangerous. A thunderstorm is forming over the Chesapeake, black and boiling, the kind that pilots are trained to fear. The tower operator peers through rain-streaked glass and sees something insane. A silver P-51 Mustang rolling down the runway into the storm. The voice crackles over the radio. Langley Control. NACA Test Flight 242 commencing turbulence entry. The operator freezes. Negative. NACA 242. Abort takeoff. Repeat. Abort. No response. The plane lifts, climbing hard into the black. Lightning flashes against the clouds, reflecting off its polished skin. The men in the tower can't believe it. No pilot would ever fly into that wall of weather, not voluntarily. But the man in that cockpit isn't just a pilot. He's a test pilot. His name is Robert A. Bob Champine, age 29. Former Navy fighter ace, now a civilian engineer with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the quiet government bureau that would one day become NASA. He's not chasing glory or breaking records. He's chasing data. Inside the cockpit, his world is a violent blur. Rain pounds like bullets on the canopy. The horizon vanishes. The altimeter needle jerks wildly as the aircraft is tossed by invisible hands. Static fills his headset. Every few seconds, lightning flashes. A white explosion that blinds him. His instruments flutter and reset. The artificial horizon flips upside down. He steadies the stick, throttles up to 2,800 RPM, and watches the numbers on his dashboard flicker. The readings matter more than his heartbeat. He mutters into the recorder, entering cumulonimbus layer, indicated airspeed 220, manifold pressure steady. The plane jolts. His head slams against the canopy. The seat harness cuts into his shoulder. But the engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650, keeps running. That's why he's here. For years, pilots had feared storms more than enemy fighters. In heavy rain or rapid icing, engines stalled, props froze, or cylinders drowned in water vapor. Hundreds of airmen had died not from combat, but from clouds. NACA's engineers believed they could fix it, if they knew what was really happening inside those storms. But the military refused to test it. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. So Champine volunteered. If you want to know what kills airplanes, he'd said, you have to go meet it in person. He wasn't exaggerating. The conditions inside a thunderstorm are violent enough to shatter wings. Wind shear can flip a bomber upside down. Lightning can jump through instruments. Rain can flood carburetors. It was suicide. And yet here he was, flying straight into it. Alone, unarmed, unaccompanied. With 152 instruments recording every second of the chaos. The aircraft bucked like a bronco, his seat harness strained. The windshield fogged. The oxygen system crackled. But the Merlin engine, that temperamental beast that had carried Mustangs over Berlin, refused to quit. That was the point. If it could keep running here, it could run anywhere. Outside, lightning turned the sky into daylight for half a heartbeat, and in that flash, Champine saw something most pilots never saw up close, the shape of a living storm, a spinning cathedral of vapor and death. He smiled through gritted teeth. "Still holding," he said into the mic. From the ground, Langley's tower heard nothing but static. Then, faintly, "Still recording. She's holding together." Minutes later, the radar blip disappeared. Everyone in the control room thought he was dead. But 28 minutes later, a voice came through the static again. Calm, precise, alive. "Langley, this is NACA 242. Data record complete. Request landing clearance." He'd survived. The storm hadn't killed him. The engine hadn't stalled. He had flown straight into chaos and brought back the math. That flight would become legend inside NACA, the day a pilot proved that science could conquer fear, that a man could face nature itself and come back with data instead of death. For the men on the ground, he was crazy. For aviation, he was the reason storms became survivable. And for Bob Champagne, it was just another day at the office. Through the long years of World War II, one explanation haunted every crash report that didn't involve bullets: pilot error. It was an easy verdict and a comforting one. If pilots simply panicked, the machines could stay blameless. The manuals stayed unedited. The engineers stayed secure. But that was a lie written in blood. The truth, buried in thousands of flight logs, was far colder. The machines were failing their pilots. In the skies over Europe and the Pacific, Allied aircraft didn't always fall because they were shot down. They often fell because their engines quit, without warning, without logic, and without mercy. It happened at high altitudes, in storms, or even in clear skies. The propeller would slow, the manifold pressure would drop, and a few seconds later the engine would cough itself into silence. Pilots called it the whisper before death. Commanders called it inexperience. The factories called it a mystery. The data said otherwise. At NACA, the quiet team of engineers and test pilots studying wartime losses began to see a pattern. Engines weren't failing because of fear. They were failing because of airflow. The problem was invisible, the thin layer of chaos that forms where air meets metal. Engineers called it boundary layer separation. In certain flight conditions, heavy rain, turbulence, or ice buildup, airflow over carburetor intakes became uneven. The fuel-air mixture went wrong. Cylinders flooded. The engine stalled. On the ground, these conditions could be simulated, but the simulations never matched real flight. No wind tunnel could recreate a thunderstorm. That's why NACA needed pilots like Bob Champagne, men who could fly not for glory, but for data, who would go where math failed to find the truth hidden inside terror. Champagne had watched too many pilots die during the war to accept the official story. As a Navy combat veteran, he'd seen Corsairs and Hellcats fall from the sky for no reason. Pilots blamed themselves until the end. But he knew the truth wasn't in the cockpit, it was in the carburetor. After the war, NACA began investigating these unexplained losses. One test after another, in controlled weather, couldn't replicate the conditions. The data was clean, perfect, and meaningless. So Champagne proposed something insane: fly into the mess. He said it plainly in a 1946 meeting. If the atmosphere kills airplanes, we should ask it how. His colleagues laughed nervously. The director called it unnecessary heroics. But the chief engineer, John Stack, one of NACA's most brilliant aerodynamicists, said nothing. Later, he walked up to Champagne and handed him a flight order marked experimental. That's how it began. Not with orders, but with permission to break them. The myth that pilots panic had lasted because no one dared to prove otherwise. The manuals told aviators never to fly near thunderstorms, never to exceed structural limits, never to experiment in weather. Champagne planned to violate all three. But he wasn't reckless. He was methodical. He redesigned his P-51D's carburetor system to record airflow and fuel pressure under stress. He mounted temperature sensors along the intake manifold, wrapped the wing leading edges in foil thermocouples, and wired an experimental recorder to log readings on magnetic film, 152 data points every second. It was the most complex instrument package ever flown in a piston aircraft. He told his ground crew, "We'll get the truth, or we'll get a funeral." No one knew what to say. To the untrained eye, his plan looked suicidal. But to an engineer, it was the only way to bridge the gap between theory and reality. Champine understood that fear didn't cause stalls. Physics did. And physics didn't care about orders. That was his quiet rebellion. He refused to let superstition and procedure decide what men could or couldn't learn. While others saw clouds, he saw equations. The storm wasn't his enemy. It was his classroom. He'd proved that engine stalls weren't about nerves, but about nature. That when a plane failed, it wasn't because a pilot lost his cool, but because engineers hadn't yet faced what he was willing to fly through. He didn't know if he'd survive. But if he did, no pilot would ever again be blamed for dying in a storm he didn't understand. And that made the risk worth it. Because in aviation, progress always begins with one man deciding that the manuals are wrong. World War II was a laboratory disguised as a bloodbath. Beneath the battles and propaganda, a secret war raged, not between armies, but between engines and air. Every nation's survival depended on its ability to make machines that could fly higher, faster, longer. But in the 1940s, no one really understood how air behaved at speed. The equations were half theory, half faith. For the Americans, victory in the air had come at a brutal price. And much of that price wasn't paid in combat. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces lost over 12,000 aircraft to mechanical failure. That's more than twice the number lost to enemy fighters. For every P-51 Mustang shot down over Europe, another was lost somewhere over Kansas, Texas, or the English Channel, to icing, flameouts, or sudden stalls. It wasn't cowardice. It was physics untested. Pilots called it the ghost in the throttle. The enemy you couldn't see, only hear for half a second before everything went silent. During the war, engineers were too busy producing machines to study their flaws. Quantity was victory. If one plane crashed, a dozen more rolled off the line. But after VJ Day, the mood changed. The production lines went quiet. The rush for new technology, jets, rockets, supersonic flight, demanded something the wartime factories had ignored: understanding. That's where NACA came in. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics had existed since 1915, a quiet government think tank tucked into the swamps of Virginia. During the war, they'd helped design wings, propellers, and airfoils for every major Allied aircraft. Now they were tasked with something even harder: making flight safe. To the public, NACA was invisible. But to the pilots who risked their lives every day, it was the difference between science and superstition. That's why when post-war accident reports began piling up, fighters falling out of clouds, engines dying mid-flight, NACA knew the solution wasn't discipline, it was data, and they knew only one man would volunteer to get it. Robert A. Champine wasn't just another test pilot. He was a bridge between two worlds: the disciplined courage of wartime aviators and the analytical precision of engineers. He'd flown F-6F Hellcats in the Pacific, earning a reputation for coolness under pressure. After the war, instead of chasing fame, he joined NACA as a research pilot. He traded combat missions for clipboards. His colleagues joked that he was the only man who reads the equations before he risks his life. Champine was fascinated by airflow, how something invisible could kill or save you depending on the angle. He'd seen the way weather could destroy a squadron, how a wall of clouds could turn confident men into statistics. He began to suspect that the real frontier of flight wasn't speed, it was stability. He studied hundreds of post-war crash reports. The same phrases appeared again and again: engine failure, power loss, fuel starvation, stall unwreck. It was a pattern hidden in plain sight. When the war ended, thousands of aircraft were sold as surplus to civilian pilots. Within months, the same deadly failures started killing farmers, mail flyers, and bush pilots. One crash in particular haunted him: a P-51 ferry pilot in Georgia who radioed, "Entering light rain, engine roughness," and vanished minutes later. The wreckage showed no bullet holes, no fuel leak. The carburetor was clogged with ice. That's when Champine realized the war's most dangerous enemy hadn't been defeated. It was weather. At NACA, engineers knew the solution would require real data: airflow readings, temperature gradients, fuel pressure variations, collected inside actual storms. No laboratory could reproduce those conditions. No wind tunnel could mimic turbulence or liquid water ingestion. That meant only one thing: someone had to fly into the storm and record it by hand. Champagne volunteered instantly. His superiors hesitated. One called it reckless. Another said, "We can't risk a national hero on a suicide experiment." Champagne replied, "Then don't call it suicide. Call it calibration." He knew exactly what was at stake. The post-war aviation boom was coming. New airliners, private planes, experimental jets. If they couldn't solve the mystery of stall and icing, thousands more would die in peacetime skies. This wasn't a daredevil stunt. It was a race against ignorance. He told a friend over coffee at Langley's cafeteria, "In combat, we fought men. Now we're fighting physics. I think I prefer the men." That sentence summed up the quiet war that began after the big one ended. A war fought not with bombs, but with equations, courage, and weather maps. The world thought peace meant safety. For test pilots like Champagne, peace just meant the experiments got lonelier. And somewhere above Virginia, a new kind of storm was waiting. One that would test whether courage and mathematics could coexist in the same cockpit. Because in 1946, the only way to make flying safe was to risk dying for science. The calm precision of post-war aviation statistics concealed a brutal truth. The war hadn't ended for test pilots. It had only changed shape. The enemy now was failure itself, measured in graphs instead of gunfire. By 1946, the United States Army Air Forces and NACA jointly tracked every flight incident on American soil. Their conclusion was chilling. One test aircraft was destroyed every 4 days, and most of those losses weren't combat veterans or reckless stunts. They were test flights. Controlled, scientific, approved. Planes fell from the sky while measuring how not to fall. The numbers read like epitaphs written in engineering shorthand. Altitude, 10,300 feet. Weather, icing, turbulence moderate. Cause, power loss, probable carburetor failure. Outcome, fatal. The recurring pattern was the same: engine stall in turbulent air. For piston engines of the era, especially the Merlin and Pratt & Whitney series, air-fuel mixtures were everything. Too rich, and the engine drowned. Too lean, and it detonated itself apart. But storms, humidity, and sudden temperature shifts created chaos that no lab model could replicate. Rain could literally choke the engine, droplets slamming into intake manifolds, disrupting airflow, and cooling carburetor throats below freezing even at 70 degrees ambient temperature. That's why NACA's engineers started calling it the invisible ice. It didn't form on wings where pilots could see it. It formed inside the heart of the machine. Pilots never had a warning light. One moment, full power. The next, silence. In Europe, that silence had cost lives. Bomber pilots described it vividly: flying through storms at 20,000 feet, engines suddenly sputtering, propellers windmilling uselessly. Crews called it the death roll. In the Pacific, carrier pilots died within sight of home, engines cutting out on final approach after long missions through tropical squalls. When engineers examined wrecks, they found the same residue: moisture in carburetor throats, frozen venturas, clogged intakes. It was a mechanical disease, and no one dared to fly inside the storm long enough to study it. Except Bob Champagne. He studied the math of the failures, tracing each accident backward like a detective following clues through wreckage. He discovered that in severe turbulence, engine pressure ratios fluctuated as much as 25% within seconds, far beyond what the carburetor could stabilize. Every bounce of the propeller's RPM changed fuel flow. Every shock wave twisted the intake pattern. The result, unstable combustion, what pilots called rough running. But rough didn't describe it. It was organized chaos. If the oscillation lasted too long, cylinders overheated and cracked. If the pilot throttled back to compensate, the sudden cooling froze the carburetor. No pilot could save the engine because no one knew what was happening inside. The physics were ruthless. Rain ingestion reduced available thrust by up to 15%. Icing could form in seconds, even in warm air. Lightning-induced electrical surges could spike magnetovoltage by 1,000 volts, frying the ignition coils. And in an era before radar and satellite forecasting, every storm was a mystery waiting to kill someone. That's why Champigne's idea to fly directly into a storm wasn't madness. It was the only logical experiment left. Nassier's lab data meant nothing without context. The war had proven that real weather was a different universe. To design engines that could survive it, they needed a map, one written in turbulence, not ink. So Champagne began designing his flight plan like a soldier drawing up an assault on an invisible enemy. He picked his test aircraft, a P-51D Mustang, serial 44-84973, retrofitted with sensors and recorders. He selected a storm system forming over the Chesapeake, a humid, electrically charged cell climbing 20,000 feet. And then he did what no pilot had ever done deliberately. He requested clearance to fly into it. Langley's tower refused. The weather officers warned him, "You'll lose control. You'll lose the wings." His colleagues begged him to wait for a smaller storm. Champagne just smiled. Smaller storms don't give you full data. He wasn't reckless. He was methodical. He had calculated the tolerances of his airframe, the stall margin of the Merlin, even the probable G-loads of the turbulence. The math said survival was possible, but not guaranteed. He logged it in his notes. Estimated structural limit, 8.2 G. Probability of exceedance, 35%. Probability of carburetor stall, 78%. Probability of pilot panic, 0%. It wasn't bravado. It was preparation. He had trained himself to fly by instruments alone, to keep calm when the world outside turned to static and noise. Because the goal wasn't to survive the storm, it was to measure it. Every second of his flight would be recorded by 152 sensors, collecting over 9,000 data points per minute, the most complex atmospheric test ever attempted without automation. If he made it back, that data could save lives. If he didn't, his last moments would still teach something. That was the grim math of testing. Every death advanced the science by a paragraph. Champagne had no illusions. Before takeoff, he told his crew chief, "If this works, we rewrite the manuals. If it doesn't, bury me with the film reels." The crew laughed nervously. But he wasn't joking. Because in 1946, aviation safety wasn't built in factories. It was built in storms. And Bob Champagne was about to fly straight into one. April 13th, 1946, Langley Field, Virginia. The air smelled of rain and oil. The humidity pressed against the hangars like a living thing. Above, a wall of cloud rose over the Chesapeake Bay, layered, violent, pulsing with flashes of distant lightning. Most pilots looked at that sky and stayed on the ground. Bob Champagne looked at it and saw a laboratory. His Mustang, the NACA-modified P-51D, tail number 84973, sat on the tarmac, gleaming wet silver under the stormlight. Its skin shimmered with hundreds of thin wires running along the fuselage and wings. Thermocouples, barometric pickups, and vibration sensors feeding into a magnetic recorder mounted behind the seat. The technicians had been calibrating for hours. The flight sheet listed 152 sensors and 11 recording channels. They'd tested the wiring twice. They couldn't test the pilot. Champagne stood beside the wing, flight suit zipped to the neck, checklist rolled in one hand. He was calm. Too calm. One ground crewman muttered, "That guy's nerves are made of stainless steel." But inside, Champagne's thoughts were all calculation. Engine temperature, pressure ratios, mixture settings, structural stress under moisture load. He could see the equations in his head. He wasn't trying to prove courage. He was trying to prove predictability. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and began his pre-start ritual like a prayer. Battery, fuel, ignition, prop pitch, throttle cracked, primer pump. The Merlin engine coughed once, twice, then caught. The sound filled the valley, smooth and even. Through his headset, the tower voice came. Langley control to NACA 242. Thunderstorm activity northwest, severe turbulence, recommend abort. Champion pressed the mic switch. Negative control, this is the test. A pause, then, Godspeed, Bob. He eased the throttle forward. The Mustang rolled down the runway, tail rising, propeller biting into humid air. Water streaked off the wings. As the storm swallowed the sun, he rotated and climbed. At 4,000 feet, the first raindrops hit like pebbles. The noise on the canopy was deafening. At 8,000, the world outside turned gray, then black. Inside, the cockpit lights glowed faint red. The instruments quivered. The magnetic tape began recording. Entering precipitation, he muttered into the mic. RPM 2,700. Manifold pressure steady. Airspeed 210. The turbulence hit like a fist. The plane dropped 100 feet in a second, then shot upward. His shoulder harness bit into his ribs. The stick vibrated violently. The altimeter spun like a roulette wheel. He focused on the engine gauge, the one thing that mattered. The Merlin coughed once, then stabilized. Carburetor temp dropped fast, 40 degree, 35 degree, 30 degree, icing range. Mixture rich, anti-ice on, he reported through clenched teeth. Rain density increasing. Lightning flashed so close it painted the cockpit in blue-white light. For an instant he could see the inside of the cloud, walls of vapor twisting around him, alive, boiling. The radio crackled. Ground control. NACA 242, say position. Static. He keyed the mic, but the words dissolved in interference. The storm was swallowing his signal. Still recording, he said anyway, knowing no one could hear him. The G-forces built like waves. The Mustang bucked, wings flexing, rivets screaming. Rain turned to hail. The vibration meter spiked. 3.2 G, 4.7 G, 5.0 G. The artificial horizon flipped twice before stabilizing. He adjusted trim, throttled back, then pushed the nose up to regain altitude. The engine hesitated. A brief gasp like a heartbeat skipped. For a moment he thought it was over. Then the manifold pressure climbed again. The engine roared back to life. Confirmed recovery, he said, breathing hard. Carburetor heat, maintaining flow. He had done the impossible, kept the engine alive in a place no engine was supposed to run. For the next 8 minutes, he stayed inside the thunderhead. Temperature, pressure, and airspeed surged and dropped like a roller coaster. The plane felt weightless 1 second, crushed the next. Lightning struck nearby. Static arced across his gauges. He smelled ozone and burning dust. Still, he kept the wings level. Still, he kept flying. The Mustang was bleeding energy. Rain adding drag, power output down almost 20%. But the engine didn't stall. It kept breathing. Champagne grinned through the sweat. She's holding together, he said softly. He made one slow, banking turn inside the cloud, testing lateral stability. The turbulence nearly flipped him upside down. He fought the stick, muscles screaming, forcing the aircraft back on course. Enough, he told himself. We've got what we came for. He nosed down, pushing through the wall of rain. The cloud tore apart around him, sunlight bursting through. Below, the Chesapeake shimmered like steel. The storm was still roaring above him, but he was out, alive, instruments still running, film still recording. He keyed the mic. Langley, this is NACA 242, data secure, request landing clearance. The tower broke into shouts. The controllers had already written him off as dead. Roger, 242, came the reply. Cleared for immediate landing. Welcome back, you lunatic. 20 minutes later, his Mustang touched down, skidding slightly on the wet runway. Ground crew rushed forward. The aircraft was soaked, dented, pitted, but intact. Champagne climbed out, drenched in sweat, holding the flight recorder under one arm like a relic. One mechanic whispered, "What did you see up there?" Champagne smiled faintly. "The truth," he said. "It's wetter than I expected." That flight would become one of the most legendary in NACA's quiet history. The first deliberate penetration of a thunderstorm by a piston-engine aircraft, and the test that would change how engines were built forever. But for Champagne, it wasn't legend. It was logic. And in that storm, logic had survived the impossible. When the Mustang rolled to a stop and the canopy popped open, the hangar crew saw the truth written across the metal. The airframe was streaked with scorch marks. The wingtips were pitted from hail. The propeller edges looked sandblasted. Every inch of the plane told the same story. The sky had tried to kill it. But the engine was still running. Champagne sat in the cockpit for a full minute before moving. He listened to the idle hum of the Merlin, the sound of order emerging from chaos, then shut it down and climbed out, exhausted, but alive. His crew didn't cheer, they just stared. Then someone said quietly, "You made it." Champagne replied, "So did she." He handed the flight recorder to a NACA engineer, a metal canister filled with magnetic film and pulse traces. "Get that processed," he said. "It's the only reason we did this." The data took 2 days to analyze. When the engineers unspooled the tape and read the oscillograph lines, the numbers hit like artillery. During the storm, the carburetor temperature had plunged to 29 degrees, well below freezing. Yet no icing stall occurred. The new de-icing airflow channels held. Fuel-air ratios fluctuated by plus 18%, but combustion remained continuous. Manifold pressure spiked twice to 62 inches, far beyond safe limits, and the engine survived. It shouldn't have. By every previous standard, that power plant should have drowned in its own intake. Champagne's flight had proven something nobody had believed, that the new high-altitude carburetor modifications, the so-called anti-icing Venturi redesign, actually worked in real weather. The storm had tried to tear the data apart. The data had won. One engineer at Langley stared at the film for hours. "You mean the engine didn't quit?" Champagne just nodded. "Not once." The silence that followed was heavier than applause. It was the sound of science winning a war no one had declared. The readings showed that moisture ingestion, long considered fatal to piston engines, was survivable if airflow was managed properly. That single fact would rewrite maintenance manuals worldwide. The data also revealed a terrifying new insight. Turbulence could induce airflow reversals inside carburetor throats, literal backflow. But the Merlin's intake geometry allowed it to self-correct. The mechanism wasn't perfect, but it explained how pilots could survive brief power losses. For NACA, this was gold. For Champagne, it was vindication. He'd risked his life to prove that fear could be measured. And now the math agreed. The official report, labeled NACA Research Memorandum 3A-146, summarized it coldly. Engine function maintained under severe convective precipitation. No catastrophic interruption observed. But between those sterile lines was the real message. The line between theory and death had just moved. The data rippled through the aviation world. Pratt & Whitney and Allison engineers visited Langley to see the results. The Royal Air Force requested copies. American Airlines quietly adopted carburetor heating recommendations derived from the test. For every future pilot who would fly through heavy weather without losing power, that moment traced back to this: one man and one plane inside one storm. But not everyone celebrated. At Wright Field, some officers bristled. They called the experiment reckless, non-standard, even irresponsible. They argued that if Champagne had died, it would have discredited NACA entirely. Champagne's supervisor, John Stack, replied bluntly, He didn't die. The data is clean. We'll build from it. The Air Force grudgingly accepted the findings, but only after seeing what came next. The next 3 NACA flights using the same storm-tested carburetor reported 0 flameouts in conditions that had previously been lethal. Engine stall incidents dropped by 40% in less than a year. Those weren't opinions. They were numbers. The math of destruction had finally been rewritten as the math of survival. Still, for Champagne, the memory of the storm lingered. He could still feel the weight of the turbulence, the flicker of the instruments, the raw sensation of flying through something alive and hostile. When a young engineer asked him afterward, "Were you scared?" He smiled. "Of course I was scared. Fear's the reason the math matters." That was his quiet philosophy. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to log data through it. That single flight transformed how test pilots thought about limits. It wasn't about defiance anymore, it was about discipline under chaos. After the report was filed, NACA ordered the aircraft stripped and inspected. Every rivet was checked, every sensor recalibrated. The Mustang's wings were found to be slightly warped from stress. The propeller hub had microfractures from lightning shock. They asked if he wanted to retire the airframe. Champagne said no, she's earned another mission. And so they repaired it. The same Mustang that had entered a thunderstorm was assigned to a new test, high-altitude fuel flow under icing conditions, because now it was the most trusted test platform at Langley. In one act of madness, Champagne had taken an airplane designed for war and turned it into an instrument of peace, a flying laboratory for survival. He didn't care about fame. He cared about precision. His logbook entry that day was only 6 words. Severe turbulence, data recorded, engine held. But those 6 words marked the moment aviation safety grew up. Because from that storm forward, no engineer ever said again, "We can't test that." The storm had already answered. And the answer was yes, if you have the nerve to fly straight into the problem. Langley Field, late summer 1946. The lab smelled like hot ink and metal dust. Rows of oscillographs chattered, spitting out waveforms. Thin black lines on endless white paper, the pulse of an airplane that had survived the impossible. The engineers clustered around the printouts like doctors studying a patient's heartbeat. The patterns were chaotic at first, then strangely beautiful. Spikes, drops, and recoveries that told a story only they could read. This was not just a flight record. It was a translation, chaos rendered into mathematics. For NACA, this was the moment the storm turned into numbers. Bob Champagne sat quietly on a stool, coffee in hand, watching as the data crew worked. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His flight had spoken for him. The chief analyst, a wiry man named Ed Polhamus, ran his finger along the trace of manifold pressure. 22 spikes, he murmured, and it never flatlined. That's impossible. Champagne smiled faintly. Not impossible, just measured. The official report took weeks to write. When it was finally published, it was titled simply, "Effect of Atmospheric Turbulence and Precipitation on Engine Operation." It didn't mention thunderclouds, lightning, or near death. It didn't even name the pilot. But inside its 40 pages were numbers that would quietly change the course of aviation. The data proved 3 revolutionary truths. Carburetor icing could occur at 68 degrees. The test showed ice formation in warm, humid air, not just cold weather. This destroyed a decade of assumptions and led to the development of automatic carburetor heating systems. Power loss did not mean stall. Pilots had been taught to panic when engines coughed. The storm flight proved that rough running was recoverable. That single discovery rewrote emergency procedure manuals worldwide. Engine endurance was a function of mixture control, not luck. The Merlin's ability to stay alive through airflow reversals revealed that with the right tuning, even violent weather could be survivable. In other words, pilots weren't dying because of weakness. They were dying because no one had given them the data. The storm had fixed that. Within a year, The U.S. Air Force incorporated NACA's findings into new pilot training materials. The phrase pilot error began to vanish from crash reports. It was replaced with power interruption due to environmental variables. That change in language was more than bureaucratic. It was moral. Champeen's flight had exonerated thousands of dead pilots who had been blamed for their own mechanical betrayals, and it had given the living something priceless, a margin. By 1947, aircraft fitted with the new carburetor Venturi design saw stall incidents drop by nearly 40%. The results were immediate. Commercial aviation adopted the modifications too. The Douglas DC-6 Boeing Stratocruiser and Lockheed Constellation all used improved fuel-air systems directly influenced by NACA's research. Behind every one of those aircraft, in 1,000 quiet takeoffs through bad weather, lived a ghost, a memory of a P-51 flying blind through lightning, proving that the math could hold. Champeen's storm flight wasn't classified, but it wasn't celebrated either. NACA didn't do hero worship. It did results. When journalists asked for an interview, he refused. The storm was the star, he said. But within the tight circle of test pilots and engineers, the story spread like folklore. They called him the man who calibrated the clouds. His colleagues started referring to particularly violent turbulence as champagne weather. When new pilots arrived at Langley, they'd hear the story in whispers how one man had flown into the black wall and come back with equations. It became a kind of initiation myth, the line between caution and courage. Meanwhile, the data kept rippling outward. NACA used it to develop de-icing ducts, vapor separation systems, and the first primitive auto-mixture controls. The findings also informed the Air Force's early jet fuel studies, especially concerning flame stability under rain ingestion. The irony was beautiful. Champeen's thunderstorm flight, meant to test a piston engine, ended up helping design the world's first jet engines. That's how science works. Chaos at one altitude becomes order at another. And through it all, Champeen remained unchanged. He still showed up early, logged his own maintenance notes, and flew test missions no one else wanted. One engineer once asked him, "Why do you keep doing this? You've already proven your point." He smiled and said, "Because the next point hasn't been proven yet." That was the essence of post-war aviation, the relentless hunger to turn terror into truth. The math didn't stop with storms. Soon, NACA would start pushing the limits of temperature, speed, and sound itself, and the pilots who followed, Yeager, Crossfield, Armstrong, would all fly with Champeen's data printed quietly inside their manuals. Every safe landing in rough weather, every storm survived by a transport plane, every airliner that kept flying when the sky turned black, all of it traced back to that one flight. A man, a machine, and a storm that refused to be theoretical. Bob Champeen didn't become a legend because he was fearless. He became one because he refused to leave fear unmeasured. He had done what no textbook could. He gave flight a margin of forgiveness. And that changed everything. By 1947, the age of propellers was dying, and the jet age was roaring to life. Langley's hangars filled with strange new shapes. Stubby jets, swept wings, prototypes that looked more like bullets than airplanes. The names changed, the engines changed, but the math didn't. And wherever there was risk, Bob Champeen was there first. He went from flying into thunderstorms to flying at the edge of Mach 1. His P-51 was replaced by experimental jets. The P-80 Shooting Star, the XP-86 Sabre, and early X-plane prototypes that looked like science fiction made of aluminum. But the habits he learned in the storm never left him. Before every flight, he still walked around the aircraft in silence, touching the metal, checking seams, feeling for vibration through his fingertips. He didn't trust theory. He trusted feedback, data you could feel. He told younger pilots, "You can't sense stability until you've felt chaos." His colleagues respected him because he was fearless in logic, not in ego. They remembered what he'd said after his storm flight, that fear was part of the measurement. The NACA brass began calling him for every mission no one else wanted. Engine ingestion tests, flame stability trials, transonic buffet experiments, each one pushing physics past its comfort zone. In late 1947, he was assigned to fly a P-80 jet into simulated icing conditions, a kind of modern echo of his thunderstorm run. The engineers had developed a new pitot tube heating system, and they needed to prove it could survive rain, ice, and electrical discharge. When asked if he was willing, Champagne said, "I already flew inside a lightning bolt once. What's a little ice?" At altitude, the jet shook violently. Icing crept across the wings in seconds. The airflow sensors froze, giving false readings. He stayed on instruments, nursing the engine like a doctor keeping a dying patient alive. The mission succeeded, barely. The new system worked. Another quiet step forward. A pattern was forming. Whenever the research hit a wall of uncertainty, Champagne flew through it. He became known among engineers as the feedback loop. He didn't just collect data, he interpreted it mid-air. When instruments failed, he described sensations, buffeting frequency, vibration, control stiffness. And engineers later found his seat-of-the-pants estimates were within 2% of instrument readings. He had become the perfect bridge between machine and math. As jet research accelerated, Champagne found himself at the center of the transformation. NACA's storm data evolved into jet engine airflow modeling, the same principles he'd tested in clouds now used to analyze compressor stalls. A decade earlier, he'd fought water ingestion in a piston engine. Now he was studying air ingestion instability and axial flow turbines. Different engine, same problem. Nature still testing the limits of design. One day in 1948, he met a young pilot at Edwards Air Force Base, Charles Chuck Yeager. Yeager had just broken the sound barrier in the X-1. Champagne congratulated him quietly, then said, "You flew through shock waves." "I flew through thunder. We both found out fear has a frequency." Yeager laughed and called him the storm guy. They understood each other immediately, men who turned terror into test results. By 1949, Champagne's storm data had found its way into jet-age protocols. His findings on turbulence response directly influenced compressor stall suppression systems and jet fuel atomization research. He'd flown a piston engine into chaos, and now the entire jet era was borrowing his math. At Langley, a new generation of engineers arrived, young, ambitious, armed with slide rules and dreams of spaceflight. They studied his reports like scripture. The phrase NACA 242 thunderstorm test appeared in technical references for 2 decades. To them, Champagne wasn't a daredevil. He was the first pilot who treated fear as data. In 1950, when NACA began its transition toward high-speed flight research, Champagne helped design procedures for the X-plane program. He introduced one revolutionary rule. Every dangerous variable must be measured before it becomes a myth. That single line shaped the culture of test piloting. It turned courage into a science. But Champagne himself never sought fame. He refused invitations to air shows. He rarely spoke in public. He considered flying a form of conversation between man and machine, private, disciplined, sacred. When reporters once asked him what it felt like to face a thunderstorm in a fighter, he said only, "It felt like asking God a question and getting a number back." By the early 1950s, jet research had outgrown piston engines, but the lessons of that old P-51 still powered every mission. In the records, you can trace the evolution, from carburetors to compressors, from rain ingestion to airflow resonance. The vocabulary changed, but the principle remained. Control the mixture, respect the medium, measure the chaos. That was Champagne's quiet revolution. He didn't invent technology, he invented method. A system of thinking that made the jet age survivable. Without it, there would have been no X-1, no Sabre, no space program. The man who once flew into a thunderstorm to test an engine had unknowingly written the prelude to the supersonic era. In the skies above Virginia, the air still remembered him. the storm pilot who taught aviation how to learn from pain. Every time a modern test jet breaks through turbulence, its flight computers compensating automatically. The data traces still whisper his legacy. Survival isn't luck. It's calibration. And for Bob Champine, calibration was the only form of courage that ever mattered. In the years after that flight, when colleagues called him the craziest man NACA ever hired, Bob Champine only smiled. He'd learned something that statistics could never capture, that there is a kind of reason hidden inside what looks like madness. The logic of his storm flight wasn't about adrenaline or bravery. It was about precision. It was about proving that the line between destruction and endurance could be calculated, that chaos wasn't the enemy of science, but its final exam. Every crash report before 1946 had ended the same way: cause, unknown, probable pilot error. After Champine, that sentence began to vanish. His data showed that failure wasn't random. It was measurable, predictable, and therefore fixable. The crazy pilot had turned myth into math. The transformation rippled through aviation like a quiet revolution. Airlines changed how they trained their crews to handle engine roughness. Manufacturers redesigned fuel delivery systems. Military engineers began treating weather not as an obstacle, but as a variable. In technical terms, Champine had expanded the flight envelope of human understanding. In human terms, he'd taught an entire generation that fear could be engineered out of the equation. When asked years later how he'd stayed calm while flying through lightning, he said, "You don't fight the storm, you observe it." That one sentence summed up his philosophy. Not just for flying, but for progress itself. The logic of his madness lay in this belief: that courage without measurement is waste. But measurement without courage is paralysis. Both were required to move civilization forward. What the world saw as recklessness was actually the purest form of scientific discipline, the refusal to stop asking questions when the answers get dangerous. That's why engineers worshipped him quietly. He was proof that the human mind could match the violence of nature not with strength, but with curiosity. In the years that followed, the cockpit he'd flown through the storm, that battered NACA P-51D, became a test bed for more than just airflow. It became a shrine. The mechanics refused to strip the paint scars off the leading edge, calling them lightning tattoos. They knew they were looking at the exact point where courage met calculation. In technical debriefs, Champine wrote notes so spare they bordered on poetry. Turbulence constant but periodic. Fear manageable when quantified. Data valid. Repeat recommended. Repeat recommended. That was the kind of sentence that built the jet age. The engineers who read it realized something profound. Madness, when properly measured, becomes method. The psychology of flight testing changed because of him. NACA stopped hiring daredevils and started hiring thinkers who were calm under pressure. Men and women who saw danger not as a thrill, but as a variable to be mapped. That culture became NASA. And when NASA's test pilots later rode rockets, they carried the same mindset. Panic doesn't save you. Procedures do. Fear isn't the enemy. Ignorance is. Every spacecraft checklist, every redundant system, every automatic failsafe had its philosophical root in that thunderstorm over Virginia. The lesson wasn't glamorous, but it was eternal. The laws of physics don't care if you're brave, only if you're prepared. In the archives at Langley, a note from a 1952 NACA conference still survives, written in the margin of a report on jet flameouts. Champine's storm flight remains our model for controlled exposure to risk. Controlled exposure to risk, the phrase that defined the space age. Bob Champine never called himself a pioneer. He called himself a mechanic with a notebook. But his notebook reshaped the relationship between man and machine. He died in 2003 at the age of 86. By then, the world had forgotten his name, but not his math. Every modern aircraft, from Boeing to Lockheed to Airbus, carries systems built on principles proven by his data: stall recovery, anti-icing automation, moisture-resistant ignition. He never flew for fame. He flew so that no one else would have to face death in the dark without numbers to light the way. The storm he entered was never truly left behind. It lives in every takeoff checklist, every engine startup, every weather briefing where pilots see danger and trust their instruments instead of fear. That is the logic of madness: to risk everything so that others won't have to. He didn't end the war against weather. He just gave humanity its first weapon that worked: knowledge. And when he stepped out of that P-51 in the rain, soaked, shaking, and smiling, he had already changed the future of flight. Because madness isn't flying into a storm. Madness is refusing to ask what's inside it. By the time Bob Champine retired from flight testing, the world he'd risked his life to build had outgrown propellers. The sound of the Merlin engine gave way to the shriek of jet turbines, then to the thunder of rockets. But behind all that progress, in every layer of the atmosphere humanity conquered, his fingerprints were still there. Invisible, mathematical, essential. The discipline he'd created at NACA, controlled exposure to risk, became the foundation of the jet and space programs. It was passed down from storm chaser to supersonic pioneer, from cockpit to capsule. Every test pilot who took off into the unknown carried a piece of his logic with them. Yeager breaking the sound barrier, Crossfield flying the X-15, Armstrong stepping onto the moon. Different machines, same philosophy. Measure fear. Don't deny it. Translated into procedure, that was Champine's real invention. Not a carburetor or a gauge, but a mindset. His storm flight proved something that remains true today. Safety isn't the absence of danger. It's the mastery of it. That's why modern pilots flying through squall lines at 35,000 feet trust that their engines will keep breathing. Their wings flex, the radar paints the turbulence, and the instruments whisper calm truth. They may never know the name Champine, but they live inside his legacy every time their aircraft shrugs off weather that once killed. Because 70 years ago, one man looked at a thunderstorm and saw not death, but data. The logic of that act, madness turned into mathematics, is the logic that took us from the clouds to the stars. In an age when machines are guided by computers and pilots fly by algorithms, the lesson still holds. Courage is the first step in every equation that leads to progress. So the next time lightning flashes against your airplane window, remember this: someone once flew straight into that light just to prove it could be done safely. The world called him crazy. History calls him necessary.